Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 135. It is time for this month's Q&A, so I'm going to be flying solo for this episode. We've got a few different questions that were submitted both via email as well as on some of our Instagram Q&As. And just as a friendly reminder, if there's topics that you'd like covered, by all means, please reach out. It's elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Also take recommendations on show guests and ideas and things like that. So don't be shy about reaching out. And while we're at it, it would be amazing if you would consider taking the time to not only subscribe to the podcast, but also leave us a review on iTunes. So without further ado, let's get to this month's questions. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. One scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients through the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY. For our first question of this month's Q&A, we got a submission by email, and it began with, obviously, arm injuries have skyrocketed over the past decade across all levels of baseball, but they've been especially bad since COVID threw a wrench in the yearly calendar plans of a lot of players. I know you've supported some of the highest profile athletes through their rehabs at CSP during this time, so I'm curious as to whether there have been any evolutions in your thought process on how you view or manage players through the Tommy John rehab process. I think this is actually a great question because there actually have been a number of areas where I don't know if we necessarily change things, but our perspectives on what norms are in place has actually been, markedly different in the last 6 to 12 months. I had some good conversations with Eric Schoenberg and Tanner Allen and Tyler Brady, who are 3 physical therapists at the Florida facility. I'd say that, the first one is just kind of like a genuine understanding of return to throwing timelines. I think historically we've seen 4 months kind of being the date that a lot of surgeons circled on the calendar. And I always thought it was just a little bit too soon. And there were a couple of reasons for that. The first one is you're still dealing with a situation, which I'll kind of touch on in a later response to this, where the graft is still very, very immature at that point. There's basically a situation where you're actually getting more remodeling and revascularization in that early time period. And it just seems like people are very, very different at months 5 and 6 than they are at month 4. And so what you get is you often get a very, very tentative athlete who may have just gotten back to where they need to be range of motion wise. And they're often very, very sensitive to actually laying their arm back into external rotation. So you often get this very pushy motion. So for that reason, I always kind of like the idea of waiting a little bit longer and then maybe doing a little bit of a faster ramp up and instead of spending a lot of time potentially, developing bad habits at really short distances. It seemed like, going to 5 or 6 months was a little bit more of an opportune way to attack it. Every surgeon has their preferences, and I do know that there are several, kind of premier orthopedics in the country who like that 5-month mark, and I've become more and more a fan of it. I'd say over the last 2 years is waiting that extra month. And what's nice about that 5-month mark is it really gives us an opportunity to train rotational power more before getting folks throwing. So I like to see symmetrical strength by about 4.5 months. So equal loading on the injury side as the uninjured side. And what that allows us to do is start to throw the med ball, start to build up the strength where it needs to be before we start playing catch. I just don't love the idea of actually initiating a throwing program before we have symmetrical strength between sides and before we've actually gotten the lower half going and trained some rotational patterns. So that month 4 to 5 is really a great time to start attacking med ball just a little bit more. And that's something that I think will be a mainstay in our program moving forward. And I even think you'll see some surgeons that will even push closer and closer to 6 months just so that we have a more highly trained athlete before they get started on their throwing program. And it kind of leads into my next observation is that I think sometimes in the rehab process, we focus too much on means and not enough on standard deviations. So in a previous podcast, I think the title was Tommy John Timelines. Stan Conti, was an awesome guest, just looking at, all things injury norms. And he talked about it, and Jeff Dugas, from the Andrews Institute, also had some great thoughts on this, where, we've kind of come to this point where we recognize 14 months is kind of this timeline that we would expect folks to return from Tommy John on. And what Dr. Dugas did a great job of emphasizing is that there's actually a 6 to 8 week standard deviation in both directions. Some people are going to come back faster. You might have some folks who are true years. You have others that are going to be closer to 16 months. Individual response to healing and getting range of motion back and all that is going to impact that. And certainly the time of year is going to impact when folks return to their previous level of competition. And I think one variable that's starting to impact this more and more is that we're just not seeing nearly as many, Tommy John onlys, where it's just a UCL reconstruction. Nowadays, we have hybrid techniques that may actually shorten return times, where they're utilizing the damaged native UCL and trying to repair that alongside the UCL reconstruction. So in doing so, you might be getting a little bit extra fortification. We're seeing more and more flexor repairs at the same time as UCL reconstructions, which would slow it down. Obviously we're seeing removals of bone spurs, work with loose bodies, ulnar nerve transpositions. Very rarely do you just see a Tommy John in isolation nowadays. There's many, many layers to this that, one way or another probably increase the likelihood that there could be something that either speeds up the process for some people or slows it down. And so I think we need to be mindful of not just adhering vehemently to the norm and instead, rehabbing the person that's in front of us, taking a look at their post-op notes and how they're progressing. So I think that's really an important consideration for anybody that does rehabilitate folks. And I think what it also does is it kind of leads into this next point about, like many people, I'm nervous about what's coming with revisions. And what that means is, Dr. Christopher Camp, who's a previous guest on this, actually just posted on an excellent study. Dr. Alchek was involved on it, Dr. Dines, our team doctor with the Yankees, Dr. Ahmad was on it, Stan Conti was another author. Really, really good paper that came out. The title of the paper, if you do want to check it out, it's Revision Ulnar Collateral Ligament Reconstruction in Professional Baseball. And it was done out of the Mayo Clinic, but involved some great people from a number of different places. And they looked at 69 major league pitchers between 2010 and 2016. 77% of them returned to play. Excuse me, that wasn't just major leaguers, that was minor leaguers as well. But 77% of them returned to play, and 55% of them returned to the same level of competition. And the average was about 14.5 months, so a little bit longer than what you would expect on a typical Tommy John. But I think that's a really, really important thing to backtrack and look at is 77% success rate on a Tommy John revision is not what you're getting on initial UCLs. And when you also look at 55% of them are coming back to the same level, that means a major leaguer might be coming back as a minor leaguer 45% of the time. That means that a minor leaguer might be coming back as an independent ball player. So we're realizing that the second reconstruction, the success rates are dramatically lower. And I think we've always known that. But I think what's really, really concerning is that those second reconstructions are sometimes happening in kids who are 23 years old who first had this when they were 15. So I'm genuinely very nervous just about the direction the industry is going as more and more kids have had these at younger ages. At some point there's probably a useful life on some of these ligament reconstructions. And hopefully sports medicine can keep up with some of the pace on this so that, people aren't just getting left out to dry when their ligament wears out after a period of time and they still have a lot of good baseball in them. The other hope is also that obviously rehabilitation protocols will continue to improve, over the course of time. And I actually think, to lead into my next point, that we are seeing good progressions in the way that we rehabilitate folks. I think in general, getting motion, post-operatively is easier than ever before. We've seen fewer athletes who have struggled to get motion, and certainly fewer athletes that have dealt with significant atrophy. Like things like the Mark Pro, have been very, very vital for, actually, stimulating blood flow, kind of an alternative to icing in some of these scenarios to actually get, the lymphatic system, the vascular system doing their jobs. So I think that's an important thing. And then BFR, blood flow restricted training, seems to have really changed the game with respect to how arms can, bounce back, in the recovery modes, but also how we can use it to, kind of preserve muscle mass as folks are on the rehab timeline. So there have been a lot of really cool, opportunities to kind of get better from a sports medicine standpoint, and they're working with surgical advances so that, effectively sports medicine can keep up with high level performance as athletes are throwing harder and harder, and they're doing it at younger ages, than ever before. So that's several observations, and then one last one I did want to throw out there just because I think I'm talking about progressions in many cases, like progressing in the way that we deliver throwing programs, the timelines on it, what we initiate from a rehab standpoint with various things like blood flow restricted training or even just better techniques for surgical approaches. I think there's also a place for regressions. And one of the things that, one particular case jumps out at me was an athlete who was really struggling to gain some flexion back in 2020. He was at about the 6-month mark. He had seen, one of the premier orthos in the country for it and was, about 6 or 7 months post-op and just really struggling to get flexion and having quite a bit of discomfort. And his surgeon, recommended, hey, I just need you to take a month off. It was right in the middle of a throwing program. Rarely do you see someone who, kind of at that 6 or 7 month mark just takes a month altogether. But it was one of those things where he had, some issues with range, and the surgeon recommended it and actually gave him some anti-inflammatories alongside it just to kind of help the process. And I had a call with him and our physical therapist at our facility, Eric Schoenberg. We were on the call, and he was throwing some ideas out there, more in the context of, I think I'll just keep throwing plyo care balls, and I'll just keep throwing the football, but I'll step away from the baseball. And we just stopped him in his tracks, and we said, rest is rest. Like, if you're going to do this, do it right. Don't test the waters every single day. If this elbow is cranky, you need to give it a shot to settle down. And to his credit, he took a step back, took the medicine that the doctor recommended, gave it a true month, and it has been smooth sailing ever since. Range of motion improved exponentially. He'd just been beating his head against the wall so much trying to get motion. He took a step back, and literally a month later, he had 20 more degrees of elbow flexion. He had no more symptoms, and the elbow's been pristine all the way along. And I think, one of my own shortcomings is I probably fought full rest for so long. And maybe I speak to it more in a systemic context, but there are going to be times when you get a joint that's really hot and it needs some treatments and just some downtime and potentially some medicine to bounce back. So that's something that I'm going to keep in my back pocket as we have conversations about Tommy John in the years ahead, just because I do think there's always a situation where it may be really, really advantageous. The last kind of point I wanted to mention as a learning point is, I think over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen athletes who have had Tommy John early in the season, and we've had them late in the season. That was probably one of the more interesting things about professional baseball last year, as you saw, still arm injuries being high late in the season, presumably because they hadn't built back up their capacity, coming off of, a down year from a volume standpoint due to COVID. But what I look really, really closely at these athletes who have Tommy John in February or March versus the ones that have it in September. And if you look at the February and March ones, you have to really consider what's happening. And the research isn't always pristine from a UCL standpoint, but the ACL literature is something we can look at closely because, at the end of the day, you're asking a tendon to become a ligament in both of those cases. So that ligamentization process ranges from like a really vulnerable initial state all the way to full maturation. And it's pretty variable. So, the same circumstances, like I said, are present with ACL tears, and the research is a lot more plentiful on knees than it is on elbows. It's generally agreed upon that tissue remodeling, revascularization of the ACL takes about 6 to 12 months, but you may not get full maturation of the graft until 2 years post-op. And I've heard several top-notch orthopedists who have done a lot of elbow surgery say that ligamentization is also likely about an 18-month process after Tommy John surgery. So it takes about 18 months for that ligament to really take on the tendon to really take on the property of the ligament that it's replaced. And so there's going to be an average there. Some are going to be earlier, some are going to be later. But we also know it's about 14 months average return to the previous level of competition. So using a February Tommy John as an example, that 14-month mark is going to basically be the following April. So you put yourself in that athlete's shoes trying to come back. He may be pitching in an environment that's freezing cold and he can't feel his fingers in April. And there's still probably a good, anywhere from, 4 to 10 months remaining on him trying to get all the way back, to a normal feeling in his ligament. So it stands to reason that you're gonna have a lot of high-level pitchers and high-level competition before the elbow feels 100% normal. And if we look at a lot of those spring 2020 Tommy Johns, a lot of them struggled in the latter half of 2021 when they came back. But what's really interesting is the athletes who were September-ish Tommy Johns, Justin Verlander this year in professional baseball being a great example. It's not nearly as problematic for those who have surgery at the end of the season because they do their 1 year throwing program. They work all the way back up to bullpens and show off their velocity, and then they kind of shut it down and just have a normal off season and then ramp up into the normal spring. They complete their ligamentization process in the off season / spring training after sitting out the full season. So the take home on this is that normal comes at different times. The time of year when a Tommy John takes place can dictate when that happens. I think a lot of the spring and summer 2020 MLB Tommy Johns are going to be in a much better place in 2022, as we've already seen. And, there are certainly a lot of guys out there that have forgotten what it's like to actually feel good, and we need to give them time to kind of get their feet underneath us. It seems like those fall Tommy Johns generally do a little bit better with their initial return, and there are some people that do need that subsequent year. So just some interesting lessons learned. I think we talk so much in terms of, the actual average months it takes to come back. But a lot of times it really has to do with what time of year it's happening and whether baseball is taking place and how competitive that baseball is. But the last thing I would say underneath this question about what's changed is I think we have to emphasize what hasn't changed about Tommy John rehabilitation, and that's that it's an opportunity, not just a setback. I can't overstate this enough to the players, the parents, the coaches, the rehab specialists, the strength and conditioning coaches who listen to this is never in your baseball career outside of a post-op timeline do you really get a year to a year and a half to just get your body right, to really work on not just making sure that elbow is back to normal, but optimizing all the upper extremity motion, getting your lower half working, putting on muscle mass, adding some strength, leaning out, adjusting your diet, all those things. You're never going to get that continuity in a baseball environment otherwise. So I just can't overstate enough to young athletes to make sure that you view it as an opportunity and not just a setback. At current count, we have about 7 major league players who are rehabbing at our Florida facility who have been sent home early by their teams. The majority are Tommy John surgeries. They've started up with us. There are a few that are flexor repairs or, other initiatives, but just an interesting thing on a daily basis that I find myself emphasizing to them is that this is an opportunity to get better, to learn more about how you move and what you need to do to be successful long term. So don't waste it. Make sure you take advantage of every day through that process. We interrupt this episode with a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Athletic Greens. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement with 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and claim my special offer today for 10 free travel packs with your first purchase. I'd encourage you to give it a shot too, especially because of this great offer and because it gives you peace of mind knowing that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, Cressey, to get that special offer. For our second question this month, we have, what's your approach to an athlete that has a hip external rotation / internal rotation total motion difference of greater than 10 degrees? It's actually an excellent question. And before I answer it, let's just give the rest of our listeners who may not be familiar with it a brief history of the total motion concept. Basically, there was some evidence in the literature that looked at shoulder motion, so internal plus external rotation measured at 90 degrees of abduction. We looked at baseball pitchers. ER and IR added up should create a number called total motion. And what we want to see is relatively symmetrical total motion between sides. So if you have 180 degrees of total motion on your throwing shoulder, it should be somewhat consistent on your non-throwing shoulder. Now, keep in mind that arc may be shifted. Usually we'll see more shoulder external rotation on a dominant shoulder and less internal rotation on that, both because of humeral retroversion, so kind of a warping of the growth plate that allows for more external rotation, and also potentially due to some soft tissue changes that may take place in the posterior rotator cuff as a response to all the eccentric stress during deceleration. And certainly some of the alignment things may play into this that we talk about with respect to the Postural Restoration Institute. If you go into kind of the history of this podcast, check out the one I did with Mike Reinold a couple years ago, as well as the one on asymmetry with Ron Haruska from the Postural Restoration Institute. You'll pick up some great stuff. So the idea is we want relatively symmetrical total motion between right and left shoulders, dominant and non-dominant sides, in a healthy shoulder. And when those are way out of whack, we have to start asking some questions. And typically what we see more of a problem, contrary to what was previously believed, is that a lack of shoulder external rotation on a dominant side seems to be more and more of a problem. But internal rotation is certainly an important consideration. But with that said, this question is about hips. So the first question is, do these same principles apply to the hip? And I think it's a really, really good question. And truthfully, I can't tell you one way or another. But I would say that for the most part, they should stay relatively symmetrical, even if that arc is a little bit shifted as a response to, imposed demand. Now, with that said, what's different about the hip and the shoulder is that the shoulder is a joint that's obviously geared towards much more mobility, whereas the hip is one that's geared towards much more stability. So it's much deeper hip socket. There's a thicker femoral neck, which gives rise to less motion than a shoulder would have. And that was born out of the fact that we have to weight bear on it. So what we do see very, very commonly in hips that we don't necessarily in shoulders is we see a lot of adaptive changes to the bone. Certainly, some shoulders will lay down, osteophytes, things like that. The acromion process may be shaped differently in certain people versus the others. But we very rarely see the crazy bony changes in shoulders that we see with hips. And then there was actually a great study from Dr. Mark Pillipon at Stephen Hawking's clinic that looked at hockey players. I want to say he looked at 12, 14, 16, and 18-year-old hockey players and compared them to skiers as controls. And as those players aged, their incidence of femoral acetabular impingement and labral tears went up to, I believe, 100% in that group by age 18. So all of them laid down bony changes. They developed either bony overgrowth on the head of the femur or on the acetabulum, the hip socket, or on both, which in and of itself is going to create limitations to hip flexion and internal rotation in particular. So it's not uncommon at all to see these reactive changes becoming more significant. And what will we typically see? Usually on a right-handed pitcher, you'll see a right hip that lays down a lot more reactive changes, unless we're talking about an athlete that maybe has a very closed-off delivery and really aggressively works into hip internal rotation upon landing. So what that speaks to is I'm not sure that the same level of symmetry is realistic to expect in a baseball population, just because that back hip probably adapts so much more from a bony standpoint than the shoulder. Now, with that said, I think what we do need to do is ask, why is the motion different? First off, what is the limiting factor? I'd say historically you're going to see a lot of trailing hips that lack hip internal rotation. So we can ask, hey, is it an actual bony block? Is it something, along the lines of what I've just discussed? Or is it a situation where maybe it's some protective tension, where they are effectively creating a tightness, a guarding for one reason or another? You'll certainly see people who have long-standing hip problems that present as groin pain or low back pain. So some of those things can limit folks. And I think the other thing is there an actual alignment issue? So in many cases, we have people that are very shifted through their pelvis. They have one hip that's very elevated. They may be like a classic posture restoration candidate where they're very adducted and internally rotated on the right side, abducted and externally rotated on the left side. That would be what was called a left AIC pattern. And we need to learn how to get them into their left hip and out of their right hip. And in many cases, that will translate and improve motion really, really quickly. And then we just need to train smart and get it to stabilize. What I will add to this, and this is actually fresh in my mind because I saw an athlete the other day that was an interesting case. He's an early rehab case that's back to the facility in the off season, and he had long-standing shoulder problems that he finally decided to have addressed surgically after playing internationally this season. I had seen him over the course of time. He had a right hip that was very wonky, kind of presented as about 15 degrees of internal rotation with, a symptomatic flexion, adduction, internal rotation test. So a fader was symptomatic, mildly symptomatic on a Faber, so flexion, abduction, external rotation. Two things that are making you think that this isn't a hip impingement guy, potentially with some labral stuff. It was never limiting, but it was something that, on a table would jump out. But what was intriguing is that he finally needed to get his shoulder worked on. So he had his surgery, and I just evaluated him a couple days ago, and he's about 5 weeks post-op on his surgery. He's actually just getting out of his sling. And what was really fascinating is he had about 30 degrees of hip internal rotation. So just the act of taking him away from playing baseball, even in spite of the fact that he's kind of been limited on what he can do in terms of actually supporting himself on his arms. He couldn't do a lot of the classic mobility exercises that we would use. Just getting him away from his sport has actually allowed him to achieve greater motion. So I think there's something to be said about that, because one, overuse may be a contributing factor to players losing range of motion. Sometimes they just need a little bit of washout. They need to tone down, get in a dark room, breathe deeply, whatever it may be, sleep more. And we certainly have seen athletes whose range of motion is poor when they're stressed or sleep deprived or something like that. But I think the other thing is it probably tells us that a lot of times with our training programs, we're just working really hard to play for the tie, in that there's an adaptation that's coming from playing, baseball or whatever sport we're discussing at a very high level. And the daily mobility work, the daily soft tissue work, the positional breathing, all the stuff that we're trying to do from a recovery, mobility, stabilization standpoint is probably just geared towards them not shifting too far in the wrong direction. So, it's a conversation I often have with my good buddy Brett McCabe, who's with me with the Yankees. We talk about sometimes you play for the tie with guys. And I think this is a great example of, sometimes you're really doing an athlete a great service when you just prevent them from losing motion, even if you don't gain new motion. So I think the, total motion concept is great in a shoulder. I'm not sure it's perfectly applied in a hip. But, I think we need to always be mindful of asking, why is this hip stiff? And, is it worth the cost of going to the next step to try to chase more range of motion when there's a possibility we might be plowing into a bony block? But we want to be mindful of not losing more motion if they are already pretty asymmetrical. While I've got your ear, I wanted to give you a heads up on a free baseball training webinar you'll receive when you subscribe to my free baseball newsletter. In that webinar, we talk about why different athletes need different approaches to power development, why it's essential that you learn to train outside the sagittal plane. We talk about the med balls and the plyometric variations that we like to use with baseball players at Cressey Sports Performance. We speak to why not all throwers have identical deceleration patterns or training needs. And we also speak to how your arm care programs can be improved to reduce the risk of injury and improve throwing velocity. If you want to check out this webinar, just head to ericcressey.com/baseball-content. Again, that's ericcressey.com/baseball-content. I think you'll really like it and learn a lot, and it'll help you in your training. For our third and final question of the day, we have a quick one. It says, the more I learn, the more stressful I find programming for athletes, particularly in the baseball realm where there are so many competing demands. Any tips for this? So yes, I do have some tips, and I should first off, maybe recognize that this is an incredibly common problem, not just for new coaches, but also for experienced coaches. I think one of the more challenging things is, a coach who's been doing this a couple of decades now, is you go to a seminar and you have to really consciously be aware of not coming back and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, you don't want to throw away all the things that have worked. Instead, you tinker, you maybe add that 1%, you modify things on the fly, because of the curse of knowledge is a very real thing that can lead to a lot of frustrated tapping on the keyboard as you write up programs for clients that don't really require things that are necessarily that advanced. So, a couple strategies that I've found to really help. First, you need to identify the biggest rocks and circle them. So when I do an evaluation, I'm incredibly meticulous with my note taking. And after I'm done with it, I may actually go back and either highlight if it's on a computer or circle if it's something I'm scribbling down on paper. I want to really highlight those 2 to 3 things that I view as the highest priority items. And you can even challenge yourself to say, this is what I'm going to discuss with a parent when I finish up evaluating a teenager, or this is what I'm going to relate to an agent after I see one of his players. It may be very limited cervical motion, poor single leg stability, a lack of scapular upward rotation. If it's a resting heart rate in the 80 beats per minute range, maybe we need to work on aerobic capacity. Regardless, I find when you definitively identify and highlight the highest priority items, it makes it easier to get the ball rolling on the program and build some momentum in the, don't sit in silence and overthink things kind of state that we all have been at when we stare at a computer and we're fighting that urge to make things too complex for an athlete that may just need, to understand prioritization of key principles. Second, I always think movement quality first. So when joints move efficiently, or they, in other words, they work from neutral, it has an impact on a host of other symptoms. You take longer to shift from aerobic to anaerobic energy system strategies when you work from neutral. The length-tension relationship for muscles that are involved in force production is optimized to enhanced strength and power when you work from neutral. The lymphatic system works more efficiently to optimize recovery. So effectively, moving efficiently has this trickle-down effect over multiple systems. And I think when I talk to the coaches that I really admire, the people that are really, really solid in this field, they're the ones that understand the relationships across multiple systems. And I think that's a vitally important consideration. That all comes back to quality movement. These downstream benefits are why we take so much pride in our warm-ups. Warm-ups shouldn't just get your body temperature up, but they should also work to reduce bad stiffness and improve good stiffness. For example, if we do a back-to-wall shoulder flexion drill, we're reducing the bad stiffness in the lats, the scapular downward rotators, the lumbar extensors, and meanwhile we're establishing some good stiffness in the anterior core, the external obliques, the rectus abdominis, the deep neck flexors, and the scapular upward rotators. Every exercise works on a key interdependence between bad and good stiffness in the context of the chosen movement. So if you understand that, you understand how your coaching cues, how they breathe, all these different things impact it, it's a very powerful thing. Third, I think you need to acknowledge that you might never use some of the tools in your toolbox. Obviously, this is a huge thing in the baseball world with respect to weighted ball discussions. When an 8-year-old comes in and asks, should I be throwing weighted balls? It's no, you should learn how to throw a four seam and work on catch play and moving your feet and things like that. So, I think if you're working with a, post-pregnancy client who's just looking to, lose, baby weight, you're not going to be throwing French contrast training at them, right? If senior citizens are your niche, your extensive knowledge of, plyometric progressions probably isn't going to have much of a, a high quality output for them. So if you hire a contractor to fix something in your house and he rolls in with a toolbox, but he isn't emotionally attached to the idea of using a chainsaw, hammer, screwdriver, or any other specific tool, rather he's going to match the tool to the job in question, even if it means all the other tools may be unused for that day. So you have to take a similar approach to how you interact with athletes. You have to be willing to recognize that a lot of things you've learned over the years may in fact be completely useless for you in the context of the athlete in front of you. Fourth, I think it's vitally important to batch your programs. So believe it or not, I have an easier time writing a program for a professional baseball player with 10 years in the big leagues and tons of training experience than I do writing a program for an untrained female client. And the reason is very simple. I write a lot more programs for baseball players, so it's familiar, and I have a lot of related cases from which I can draw perspectives. In other words, X athlete is similar to Y athlete, so I can build on this success I had with that first athlete instead of reinventing the wheel. And for this reason, trying to write multiple programs for similar demographics in the same, sitting is really, really an efficient strategy. You don't want to break them out to different programming sessions where you mix them in with folks who are entirely different. So if you're in this baseball realm, don't be like writing in programs for football program players and swimmers and things like that all at the same time, because you want to get your line of thought where it needs to be. As a general thumb, I never write a training program, never sit down to write a training program unless I'm going to do 3 to 4 programs in that sitting. So for me, in that 5 to 7 a.m. time block, I'm actually doing a lot of programming and trying to get into my zone with respect to that stuff. And then, fifth, and perhaps most importantly, always try to build on previous programs / successes. Most of the time when I write a program, I'm writing it right on top of the previous month's programs so that I can easily, kind of create progressions or regressions if need be. So it can, be a quick and easy adjustment on the fly so that we can assure that it's building on whatever happened, the previous month. What I will say is you should never, ever start by staring at a blank programming template. The worst thing you can possibly do is try to work from a completely empty canvas and come up with something new. You always want to build on the previous successes. And that's why documentation, note-taking, things like that are so important during the evaluation process. It always allows you to check back and see what's worked and what hasn't, so you can really figure out what some of your key competencies and approaches are moving forward. So just remember that program design is only as complex as you make it. And when in doubt, you need to simplify. So that wraps up this month's Q&A. Really appreciate you tuning in. And like I said, don't be shy about reaching out, whether it's on one of our Instagram Q&As or via email at elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much.